Hello and welcome to another episode of Whither the Looniversity, the podcast of the Peerless Review. My guest today has been prominently in the news surrounding higher education lately. His name is John Saylor. He is currently Senior Fellow and Director of University Policy at the National Association of Scholars. We will probably refer to that as NAS moving forward. But he has been researching in particular how DEI is influencing processes of faculty recruitment and hiring, and also how it's infecting the materials, the documentary aspects of faculty searches. He recently had a piece of the Wall Street Journal called How Diversity Policing Fails Science. In reaction to that piece, Texas Tech stopped requiring, I think it's DEI statements in their hiring process. He's also recently been featured on the Free Press, and he's been doing some great work. Welcome, John. Thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, how long have you been on this beat for now? Like maybe 6 months or so in terms of really digging into these questions of hiring and stuff like that?
Yeah, my interest in faculty hiring and the way it's been distorted by DEI started as I was investigating the way universities were teaching civics, the way that they were kind of modifying their curricula to incorporate social justice goals. And I kept running into this issue that has been raised for a long time. These formal diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements for hiring, promotion, and tenure. And so a lot of my kind of research and reporting over the last 6 months has really just kind of come from things that I've run across as I've really dug into university policies, and a lot of it has just surprised me, and so I write about it, and I think it surprises everyone, including many in university administration.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the different ways that you found that DEI and so-called social justice initiatives are manifesting themselves in the process of faculty recruitment and hiring.
Yeah. So, there's a really famous, widely cited op-ed by a mathematician named Abigail Thompson that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in 2018, where she compared the use of diversity statements to the past use of loyalty oaths in university faculty hiring. And now, this was especially relevant to her because she is a professor at UC Davis, and it was the UC system that really had this battle during the McCarthy era, where faculty were required to sign various statements of their loyalty to the United States, and potentially statements saying that they were not involved with any operations of the Communist Party. And that created a large debate around academic freedom, because obviously, if you're saying if you require people to sign a loyalty oath, then that establishes a kind of orthodoxy on campus, and so that brings in not only issues of kind of like hypothetical academic freedom, it also raises some First Amendment issues surrounding free speech, because academic freedom is treated in First Amendment law as a kind of free speech issue. So that happened in the UC system, and what came out of it was actually a system-wide policy saying that no political test shall ever be administered for faculty hiring. And so actually, it's kind of ironic then that what has happened since about 2010 in the UC system is that the policy that is now known as diversity statements, mandatory diversity statements, was developed, and its implementation was sort of refined And it ultimately, the policy was kind of disseminated through the UC system. And so Abigail Thompson points out in her op-ed that, hey, look, we have this policy, no political tests shall be administered, but at the same time, now we're requiring for promotion or for hiring, and in some cases then, and many more now, promotion and tenure, you have to write a statement detailing your contributions to, past and future contributions to this catch-all phrase, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the argument is that while these concepts sound good in, can sound good in theory, in practice, and I would certainly argue this with a lot of examples, that the term diversity, equity, and inclusion almost always implies a narrow set of ideological commitments, which means that you're really being asked to do something akin to these loyalty oaths that were already dealt with by the UC system. And also it's widely acknowledged that they're bad for academic freedom. That's seen as an era where academic freedom was violated, and we've come out saying that that kind of policy shouldn't happen. So what we're seeing is some people might put it as almost a new McCarthyism, but instead of promoting this kind of anti-communism, it's promoting a very different ideology rooted in, I would genuinely argue, rooted in critical race theory,
which in turn is rooted more or less in Marxism. And so ironically, we moved from this anti-communist loyalty oath almost to one that smacks of certain communist principles. So you've seen that they're requiring diversity statements, and I think somebody who might be listening to this conversation might say, "What's wrong with that?" And I think that it's really just that it's not enough in these statements to say, well, of course I value diversity, that's a good thing, right? It goes beyond that to where you have to have essentially participated in some form of agitation, right? To advance these sort of pieties. And if you say something like, well, yes, I once mentored a woman, I think this was in some of your recent work, right? They'll say, well, women are indeed, an aggrieved class, but they're not one of the aggrieved classes. And so that's not enough. And, you'll lose points for that. I imagine that the university's defense of these statements would run something like this. Look, we value diversity, right? We're well within our rights to ensure that the people that we hire value similar things as we do, so that they'll be a good fit for the mission of our institution and the objectives that we have in our learning outcomes. This is not a political test. It's just to see if there's an alignment of values. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. And it's interesting because that is an argument you get. You also get a lot of people making the argument that these statements really just aren't that meaningful in any direction. And there's some truth to that insofar as at a lot of universities, the policy is a top-down policy. Basically, some high-level DEI officer says, all job listings need to have diversity statements, or maybe a diversity committee says, let's make every job listing in our department require a diversity statement to show our commitment to the cause, but it's not incorporated often into the actual rubric for evaluating job candidates once they've actually applied. You just, as one professor at a UC school told me, we look at the statements and then we kind of just don't really care about it. That was his department, although some other people's departments, I've heard within the UC system, other departments are much more aggressive about applying the statements. So there's a lot of confusion around how they're actually applied, and there's a lot of to what extent they're weighed at all. And if they are weighed, there is this argument that, hey, well, diversity, equity, and inclusion is basically a a positive value, and it's okay for us to ask our faculty to um, ascribe to this positive value. And they might even say, and a lot of people would say, like, who would object to this? This is just something that every reasonable person would agree with, and so it should be totally fine to show your demonstrated commitment to this kind of these kinds of principles. And so there are two things to say. First is that in practice, we have pretty good evidence that when they are actually valued highly, these statements, the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it entails a much more narrow set of views. And so you mentioned earlier that I published this article for the Wall Street Journal, where I actually got a hold of the evaluations of faculty job candidate DEI statements and some DEI presentations that they gave. The DEI committee ended up interviewing faculty members, and so they gave like this little report on these candidates' potential contributions to DEI. And if you look at those, there's a clear ideological gloss. So one candidate, they were penalized, and this is basically a direct quote. This candidate said that DEI is not an issue for them because they intend to treat all of their students equally. This shows a lack of understanding of equity and inclusion issues. Another candidate, they penalized for saying, in their words, not understanding the distinction between equity and equality, which, as a lot of your listeners probably know, that distinction is basically very, very loaded. And it's pretty much a talking point that only comes up in these kind of ideologically charged DEI seminars. The idea is that equity is not equality of opportunity, but rather it's equality of outcome. And that's what you should pursue if you're pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's very much ideologically charged. At the same time, in those documents, you have instances where people were praised for saying that they have a very, or for saying that they care about things like unconscious bias and microaggressions, which on principled grounds, many people would say those are terrible concepts to employ in any situation. Or one person was praised for including a land acknowledgement in his talk. Now, those are not simply value neutral, statements. Clearly the DEI committee in Texas Tech's biology department, they came in and they had a very idiosyncratic and ideologically driven understanding of what DEI means. And I would just add that these statements are often required to be evaluated in that way. So going back to the UC system, UC Berkeley has this, they call it the rubric for evaluating faculty contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And that rubric actually kind of reflects what we saw at Texas Tech, where they say a candidate should get a low score if they intend to ignore the varying backgrounds of their students and treat everyone the same, essentially punishing candidates for expressing the desire for race neutrality, even though a lot of people on very, very principled grounds would say race neutrality is a good thing. I would say that. I think it's substantively bad to punish people for saying that they want to be race neutral. And there are actually a lot of examples within just that rubric that kind of confirm that it's not just going on at Texas Tech. It's not just a one-off thing. To the extent that these evaluations are done, they're done in an ideological way, which actually kind of makes sense because this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion is when it is applied, it is often applied in ways that would, whenever people read my reporting, a lot of them are very, very shocked that universities are openly endorsing these concepts. They are openly adding critical race theory to their required training sessions. They're openly calling for these very ideologically charged definitions of racism and anti-racism to be enshrined in university policy. And so that is actually just like a good argument that these statements violate academic freedom. Basically, DEI connotes a very narrow set of ideological views, and therefore requiring faculty to sign off on their commitment to DEI basically requires them to sign off on a narrow set of ideological views, which brings up the same issue that the loyalty oaths issue did, and we have a pretty good framework for saying that that violates academic freedom. But I'll note, even if it didn't, I think it's fair to say that this is just a very bad kind of way to prioritize faculty job candidates when you're hiring people. You know, it's all the more vivid when you're talking about candidates in biology. We're talking about virologists,
Right.
and immunologists, and cell biologists who often research cancer. These are people whose expertise in their discipline matter, you know, greatly. And I'd say expertise in your discipline matters greatly, regardless of what discipline it is. We have universities not so that people can promote DEI or promote particular social causes. We have universities so that people can, you know, excel in their scholarship regardless of the discipline. And this is basically a massive statement of priority, saying that your discipline is on par with this social goal that has nothing to do with your discipline and is ideologically charged, and you know, is essentially a kind of stand-in for progressive political priorities. That you know, anyone should agree that that's terrible.
So now I can also imagine somebody saying to you, John, you're right, that these things can be abused, right, in the hiring process. But I can hear someone saying, but that's not the intent, right? And for myself, I think, no, that's precisely the intent. Precisely the intent is to serve as a screening tool here to ensure ideological conformity and to make sure that they are not going to end up with problem professors like myself. What's your take on that? Do you think that there's some bad actors who use this in kind of a bad way, or is that usage the point?
Yeah, I would say it's hard to know what people intend when they institute these policies. And a lot of what I have found when, you know, reading these massive university level DEI plans or listening to DEI training sessions and things like that is that there's a lot of thoughtlessness. It's just very evidently thoughtless in a lot of ways. People basically see that a policy is widely adopted, or they see that a particular definition of racism is widely used. And this is really just my impression, but often it seems like they're just passing along what's handed to them. So I wouldn't really be surprised if there are a lot of people who just haven't really thought about it. But what I would say is that regardless of the intention, these statements are basically an invitation to police people for their dissenting political views. And that doesn't even matter if you use this ideologically charged Berkeley rubric, or, you know, the rubric from Emory University is genuinely even worse. It doesn't really ultimately matter if you even use those rubrics, or if you have any intention of excluding people on the basis of their viewpoints. It's likely just going to happen because this is kind of an ideologically fraught topic. It's very hard for people to approach it in an unbiased way, especially in the environment of the university. So I would say, even actually if you include certain safeguards against violating academic freedom, and people have posited different ways to do that. Yeah, in practice, I think you get the same effect. There are certainly people all throughout academia who very evidently do want to just, you know, they very evidently don't want certain people to be involved. In fact, there was a really notable example of a trustee of a community college district in California who said essentially that he wanted to put all faculty who disagreed with their equity agenda Send them to the slaughterhouse, is what he said. And I think that's an attitude that a lot of people have. They think, well, if you disagree with this stuff, you must be a racist and a bigot, and you've got to get out of here. Your scholarship can't be any good, and this is not a part of our values. And at that point, yeah, I think they're openly intending to discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, and they probably don't care so much about academic freedom in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I worry about sometimes is like if you are say you just finished a PhD and you're pursuing an assistant professorship and you're required to write one of these DEI things and you don't really believe it, but you understand you have to play the game, right? And then you get, let's say you get through all of the sort of gatekeeping, get hired, and let's say you even get tenure. At that point, you feel like, okay, well, now I can take the muzzle off, but I wonder if these DEI statements can then be used to sort of retroactively jeopardize someone's career. Because if you then later become critical of these ideas, they can go back and say, well, look, when we hired you, you said that you had these commitments, right? And now we find out that you don't. I think it would require some sort of formal mechanism in the evaluation criteria, and I think that that's really what's motivating the push to put it in. Is they want to ensure that people who can't abide by these things but can speak the language, that they have a means to weed them out if they happen to get through. So it's another layer of gatekeeping. It's a fail-safe, really.
Yeah, and I would say that that's kind of murky because for a couple of reasons. One is that this in an attempt to bypass some of the more obvious criticisms of diversity statements, typically instead of being statements on your beliefs, they are phrased as statements that describe your past and planned actions to advance a particular cause. Now, I mean, we could step back and ask, okay, so you're asking for my past and planned actions to advance a cause. Kind of entailed in that is the desire for me to embrace the cause, which is a particular belief. It's kind of like asking you to demonstrate that you've gone to mass and done your confessions every week. Well, okay, I mean, those are actions, but at a certain point it might imply that you're asking for a set of religious commitments.
It's
And
like saying, what have you done and what do you plan to do to support Trump 2024?
yeah, or make America great again.
Right.
Like, okay, well, yeah, in theory, you could do all of these actions without believing a particular thing, but let's be real. We know what we're talking about here. And so, yeah, could a faculty member end up kind of being self-incriminating by going along and then suddenly reversing course? I think it's very hard still, fortunately, for people to get rid of tenured faculty, even if they really, buck the orthodoxy. And so at this juncture, I think you would have enough cover to avoid DEI statements and DEI evaluations for promotion and tenure be coming back to bite you once you get tenure. I think that that's probably the case. It's hard for me to imagine somebody using that as the mechanism to get someone fired from a tenured post. That said, there is something interesting about what you're saying, where the policy in many ways seems to lay the groundwork more than it explicitly initiates like this vast regime of requirements that have all come to pass. When I look at, for instance, promotion and tenure policies, often what they involve is, again, just kind of showing that you have like taken time to mentor students, or they're broad enough that it seems like they are written in such a way that honestly, it seems like sometimes these policies are written in such a way that administrators want credit for doing something, but they don't actually want to rock the boat and actually do anything, at least right now. But the problem is once you have a policy in place that says we should consider diversity, equity, and inclusion in promotion and tenure, there's nothing stopping someone else from coming along later and saying, hey, look, it's a part of your job, it's a condition for your promotion and tenure to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And whereas the last guy defined it in a very broad way that was, perhaps genuinely not all that demanding, we have a different definition that is, far more substantive and far more demanding. Again, a lot of the issue with the policy is also simply that it invites and gives license for pretty much an unending amount of kind of like gatekeeping, even if it hasn't happened in the present.
Well, this is my concern. I mean, my department, over my many objections over the last year and a half, just published a department anti-racism statement. And on many occasions, I asked them, I said, look, me and a few other faculty who really are not as outspoken as I am, might not agree with these principles. There's ways that you could craft this statement that it doesn't put words in other people's mouths. And instead, a select group of faculty went off to craft the statement. There was no vote on whether or not the faculty agreed with it. Like that would have helped me because at least then they could say, all right, well, we lost 72, 30, right? I guess we're the losers, right? There was no vote. It was just put on the website. And it states very clearly that we, the faculty of the English department, value the practice of these principles in our teaching and our research, right? And what worries me is it's like, okay, well, I mean, first off, I'm offended that they would deign to speak on my behalf. But more than that, I'm worried that 5 years down the road, they say, well, look, we don't have DEI requirements in our tenure criteria right now, but we've already said that we all agree on these principles. So if we do, why shouldn't we have DEI in our principles? If this is really something the department believes, then why shouldn't the tenure criteria be revised to reflect those commitments? And I suspect that that's really what it is. It's kind of just a crowbar to get in there so that later on we could say, well, geez, we really aren't living these out if there's ultimately no policy means to discharge someone who is not furthering those commitments. So I think
it's crazy because there's really there are so many of these tools that allow the policies to be ratcheted up. So on one hand, the term DEI is vague and euphemistic, and it sounds genuinely really good. And it's the kind of thing that a lot of people are simply afraid to object to on the grounds that on those grounds. So on one hand, you have this euphemistic term which is very costly to object to, but very, ultimately it actually signifies a lot of substantive things. And then on the other hand, certain claims that are tied to the concepts of DEI are once they're established as true, they're almost seen as unassailable. So claims about race, racism, the edicts, I hesitate to paint with broad brushstrokes because there are a lot of different ways these policies are applied, but often it's the case that these edicts simply make it so it's very, very hard to object to certain people saying that we feel like we've been discriminated against, or we feel like there is racism here. And
right.
Once you have this unassailable claim, then a lot of people can truly ask for whatever kind of policy concessions they want, whether that's changing the curriculum, changing promotion and tenure standards, shaping the research agenda of a university, shaping the hiring agenda. It's remarkable to see how easily the entire DEI bureaucracy grows. But if you consider those kinds of mechanisms, it really makes a lot of sense.
So I wonder, you elicited a actual policy response from Texas Tech, and there are some other universities that you have directly mentioned in your reporting. Have you had any response directly from these universities? Have they contacted you, reached out, anything?
Yeah, for the most part, no. The one exception would be in my role as policy director for the NAS. If there are people within universities who are sympathetic to the kinds of things I do, I am kind of available. Or sorry, I might have said policy director. Technically, director of university policy. Um, um, but yeah, it's kind of baked into my job to talk to people about university policy if they're interested. That said, what I was expecting from Texas Tech was a letter to the editor responding saying that I am wrong and here are all the reasons that these statements are good. I was very delightfully surprised that they agreed with me and decided that this policy was a bad thing. I think that one of the obvious reasons for that is that Texas Tech is in a very red state, and they are responsive to the rules given by a conservative governor and conservative legislature, and so they recognize that if they don't address the policy, then they could have sort of there could be legal remedy or rather legislative remedies to it, and they it seems like they just wanted to get out ahead of it. Good for them. Very glad that they did that. We'll see how it works out in implementation, but that seems to be all good. But yeah, most of the time I don't hear anything from university administrators, or they respond and say, well, this is really a great policy and I can't believe you hate diversity or something like that.
On the last episode, I talked to Scott Yenner, who is a professor at Boise State and is now at the Center for the American Way of Life. And he said that phase one in challenging the corruption of higher ed is stigmatization, to stigmatize them and scandalize them for what they're doing. And I think that it's true that a large swath of the public that supports public universities has no idea that this is going on. And so the real key is making the public aware, which essentially embarrasses the universities. I think if I had to, if I had to guess, this is where the success of your reporting is coming in, is you're embarrassing them.
Yeah.
They would
Yeah.
really rather that the public not know what's going on and this stuff remain behind closed doors. And so if it's that kind of campaign of stigmatization, embarrassment, it's very important that faculty, even if anonymously, will divulge maybe materials to you, talk to you if they have information about these trends. Do you think that that's the game, the stigmatization and humiliation game?
Yeah, and we'll see. I have sort of a whole series of articles and reports that many of which are finished and scheduled to come out that will kind of test that hypothesis and also test how far things go. In some states, it's not likely that anyone will care about any of this. In
Right.
some states, people will care about some of it, but not all of it. They'll and I think it's intuitive to almost everyone if they get a good faith explanation of the DEI statement policy. It's intuitive to almost everyone that there's something wrong with that. But they might still be okay with universities having a DEI office or putting on DEI trainings or policies that I would sometimes expose and bring up and show the downsides of. Some people are not going to be moved by that. So what I'm interested in doing is exactly what you say, continuing to expose these policies that I genuinely think are crazy and newsworthy and very well could get the attention of universities. I don't know with universities in Michigan and Wisconsin and Indiana, who knows? Who knows how responsive they are to this kind of criticism? But the best thing I think to do is to try to uncover things and find out. And I've been very delighted to kind of receive many tips and inside information about the sort of you know the very specific operating mechanisms that universities use in this kind of evaluation, because that is an extremely useful tool for me to come in and get documents through public records requests. And yeah, I would just say stay tuned, because there's a lot more where this came from.
So I do have one question for you after this, but while we're on the subject, if someone wanted to talk with you or provide you with some information, what's the best way that they could reach you?
I'm very responsive to messages on Twitter, so I'll throw that out there. My Twitter handle is John D. Saylor, Sailer. I will say it's actually pronounced Seiler, but nobody knows that. And I'll, you've got the my inside information now.
Seiler. But we should
Seiler, yeah.
stress it was a little unclear that your last name is spelled Sailer, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So it looks like a misspelling of sailor, and it is looks like it should be pronounced sailor, pronounced Seiler. You're welcome to follow me and message me on Twitter, but also my email address is seiler@nas.org, and I'm pretty responsive to these things and love getting tips, because that's pretty much at this point a big source for my reporting.
Great. So last question. Let's say we beat the DEI Hydra in faculty hiring, and that all these universities stop using diversity statements, sort of stop keeping a finger on the scale in various other ways on who they hire or who gets through the gates. What would be the next target after this? What's the next frontier in sort of reforming the institution?
Yeah, I think of this in really two steps. So the first thing that we're going to have to do, and I'm convinced that it really is only going to come for the most part through public policy, is excise the kind of growth of DEI that's taken over in the universities. And I think it's appropriate at this point, given what we know about these departments, to say we don't want any of this. And so, the Manhattan Institute has released that fabulous model legislation that was developed in close collaboration with the NAS, actually. So, I think it's a fantastic set of bills, and that's a start to get rid of the DEI bureaucracy, to specifically ban diversity statements. But you still have, I think, a couple of major issues that still face universities. For instance, you have a kind of lack of good personnel to function in university administration and university leadership, because for years, people who have a commitment to things like the traditional liberal arts, to academic freedom, to a view of the university that is more in line with a classical understanding of education, those people have just been driven out of the university, and that creates a big problem for kind of like the high level higher education administration. I mean, related to that is just the fact that many faculty jobs now, as you very well know, are designed to, even if they don't solicit a diversity statement, they basically have that content written into their the job requirement by way of asking for a specialty that is essentially rooted in kind of a social justice activism or ideology. So I wrote an article recently about Ohio State. Ohio State University initiated this massive hiring spree that was really made it so almost every job within the university was focused on race, gender, social justice, critical theory, or something like that. And so you got these ridiculous job listings, like the philosophy department's only job, the only job that they listed was philosophy of race, which included things like epistemology in race or the philosophy of science in race. This is nonsense. That is not actually. I'm convinced philosophy of race is not actually a real discipline. My favorite though was their Department of Slavic Languages had a position in indigenous Siberian studies, which is so funny. And it was like this mix between, kind of legitimate areas of I guess Siberian studies and kind of anti-colonial, decolonial lingo, which I would guess the department did not want to actually include, but it's clear that was the only way they were going to get a faculty line at all. And so we've kind of distorted the faculty very considerably. And both of those first 2 points has led to a curriculum that either by design or de facto because of the personnel issue is really distorted, and the education that students are going to get is going to be really tilted towards a kind of social justice activism. And there's just a lot of good evidence for that if you ever look at a syllabus or look at the course listings at just like a regular public university. So those are really big problems, and I think the only way to solve those problems ultimately in the long run is kind of to engage in a multi-year, multi-generational capacity building project that's going to have to involve a lot of buy-in from state legislators. It's going to have to involve a lot of buy-in from nonprofits like ISI or other organizations that help kind of bring up students who are interested in academia. It's going to have to involve think tanks like the NAS, but also like other think tanks who have done good work on this issue. And ultimately, I think that something like that needs to culminate in trying to aggressively build new things within existing institutions. Higher education is not going to go away. Like, I am not the kind of person who says everyone needs a college degree. I actually think we overemphasize college degrees, and it's good to take public policy steps saying, no, not everyone needs to go to college. We actually need to create pathways for people outside of college. But at the same time, we are not going to stop needing scientists. We're not going to stop needing to credential doctors and lawyers. We are not going to stop needing people who are trained in the liberal arts, because the liberal arts, I think, are inherently valuable, and there are certain people who ought to have a good education like that. So we can't abandon higher education, and I don't think we have the capacity to rely solely on new institutions. I think we need to renew within. And I'm heartened by the fact that places like the University of Florida, the University of North Carolina are building new schools within their universities that are focused really on these ideals of academic freedom and, maybe kind of a traditional liberal arts education. And I think we just need more of that. We need more creative versions of that. And that has to be a part of the picture of within this larger capacity building project. That's going to be the only way if we want to renew the universities, which I think is really important for our country and our civilization. We have to engage in that kind of project.
You kind of just put your finger on one of the main subjects of debate on this series, which is I noticed that NAS is looking for new board members, and Peter Wood phrased who they're looking for, the type of person, very carefully in the letter. And he said, we are not looking for people who want to burn Carthage to the ground and salt the earth. And I think that that's kind of people who are really deeply concerned about what's going on in the university right now. That's really the question, is reform from within or without. And it's nice for change. I talk to a lot of people who say burn Carthage and salt the earth. It's good to hear you say that it can be done from within.
It has to be. There's no amount of philanthropic initiatives. I love the idea of building, University of Austin. I hope it succeeds and that more similar institutions like that exist. But there's no amount of philanthropic ventures that are going to match the power a budget that comes from a state legislature or an endowment that has existed for as long as Ivy League school endowments have. So really, the only way it's going to happen is if we is if we try rather than run away from the universities. I think we need to create incentives for good people who believe in kind of all of these values, like the traditional liberal arts and academic freedom and open inquiry, to run towards the universities, which of course right now is a really hard ask, because you run towards the universities and you can't get a job, and if you get a job, you're ostracized and discriminated against on the basis of your viewpoint. So it's a bad environment right now. We need to make that environment better, and we need to tell more people, yes, you should try to be a scientist, a scholar, a philosopher. That is valuable, and to whatever extent we can get more people to invest in that project, I think the better, and that's really where our hope should lie.
Fantastic. John Seiler, Senior Fellow and Director of University Policy at the National Association of Scholars. John, thanks so much for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, been a blast.